So good morning, everyone. My name is Stacy Stanislaw, and I'm the Communications Manager for the Drexel Libraries. I want to thank you for joining us for this morning's webinar, Using Archives, an Introduction to Archival Research. This session is part of the library's fall webinar series called Building Connections to Scholarship. The event series includes over 15 different sessions that focus on tools and systems that the libraries provides to help Drexel Dragons with their research. You'll find all the details about this series on our website, and I'll add a link to the chat box in just a second. Now, before I turn it over to Simon, I want to run through a few pretty standard logistics. First, keep yourself muted during the presentation if you could. And if you have any questions, just insert them into the chat, and I'll make sure that Simon sees them or that I read them out loud as we go through. Next, I just want to note that we are recording this session, and I'll post the recording on our YouTube channel later today. I'll also send all the attendees an email with a link to the video and then a link to a very short survey. And we would love to hear your feedback on this session afterwards. So now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Simon. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks. So I'm Simon Raghavan. I'm the archives technician in the Drexel University Archives, and I will be giving you a short introduction to archival research. In this webinar, I'm going to briefly tell you what an archives is, and then I'll cover the main differences between libraries and archives, how the research process is different, and what to expect when you visit an archives. I'll briefly cover the different kinds of archives that are out there, and I'm going to say a little bit about how to find an archives with material that will be useful to a specific research question, but that's actually complicated enough that there's going to be a separate webinar about that in the future. And as you'll see, there are photos throughout the presentation, all of which are from the Drexel University Archives. They're there to give you a small taste of what we have. And if there's a particular image you want to know more about, then you are very welcome to get in touch with us at archives@drexel.edu. So what is an archives? The short version is that archives are where items of enduring historic value are cared for and are made accessible to researchers. So what this means in practice is that archives have the records of organizations, families, and individuals in various formats, usually paper and photographs, but often some audiovisual formats, and these days, born digital media. So part one, how archives are organized. Archives are organized pretty differently from libraries. Libraries have books. There are multiple copies of the books. In other libraries, the books are cataloged and organized physically by topic, whereas archives have almost entirely unique primary sources that are organized in collections. And I'll get into collections in the archival sense a bit later on. Unlike most libraries, you can't browse the shelves of an archives because items are usually unique, and because of how they're organized, only staff are allowed into collection storage areas. Material doesn't circulate, so if what you're interested in isn't already digitized or it's unfeasible to digitize it for you, then you have to look through the material in the archives reading room. You've probably seen historic photos and documents online, but only a small proportion of archival material has been digitized and uploaded. Even repositories like the Library of Congress, which has a huge amount of digitized primary sources on their website, has only digitized a small proportion of everything that they have. To a large extent, this is due to digitization being expensive and time-consuming. So archives have to make decisions about priorities based on a lot of different factors. And another thing is that, sorry, my setup is not ideal right now. Okay. Another thing is that whereas libraries, list all the books and journals and databases and audiovisual resources and things that they have in their online catalog, even though archives have a lot of information about their collections on their websites, you can expect that some collections which just will not be mentioned at all. There won't be information about everything. To kind of continue with the differences between libraries and archives, if the main unit for a library is a single book, to be simplistic, then the main unit for archival material is the collection. And a collection is usually a group of material that was created by the same individual, family, or organizations. They're often arranged, which is the archival term for organized, into sections, which we call series and subseries. So for example, a collection may have a series of correspondence and a series of photographs. And then the photographs may be organized into subseries based on who's in the picture or where the photos were taken or the dates or some other criterion. There's a lot of different ways that a collection might be organized. And collection sizes vary a lot. A collection may be as small as one folder with a few pieces of paper in it, though that is unusually small, or it could be hundreds or thousands of boxes covering thousands of linear feet. Collections that have been processed will have a finding aid, which is a guide to what the collection contains and how it's organized. Finding aids vary. They may be one page or hundreds of pages. And what you will find in a longer finding aid would probably include a lengthy biography or administrative history about the creator, lots of detail about what the collection contains and how it's organized, and probably a list of every single folder title and the date for the folder or a date range. But at minimum, you can expect a finding aid to have a title, date or date range, some information about the creator, and some information about what it contains and how it's organized. But large collections may not have very long or detailed finding aids. That varies a lot as well. So because of all these differences in how things are organized and how you find and access material, doing archival research is pretty different from using a library for research. So just like how librarians are experts at helping researchers find information in published sources like books and articles, archivists are experts at helping researchers find material that will be useful to them in archival collections. However, researchers are reliant on archivists to access material. Unlike when using library resources for research, you're unlikely to find what you need without the help of an archivist. So an important takeaway from this webinar is that when in doubt, ask an archivist. This will probably be an early step in any research you do with archival collections. So what can we actually do to help you? So like I said, not all collections have finding aids on an archive's website, and finding aids have varying levels of detail. So it may not be clear from the finding aid that a collection has something that is relevant to what you're researching. So for example, Helen Spring was the first director of the Department of Domestic Science at Drexel, which has evolved into what is currently known as the Westfall College of Media Arts and Design. Her name appears only twice in our finding aids, but there's definitely more information about her in our collections. She ran this department for many years. So for example, if someone were researching her, then one thing I would do is I would check the annual reports collection from the time when she worked at Drexel. I know this is a good possibility just because I'm familiar with Drexel's institutional history and with what our collections cover. Another example is that we don't have a collection that is about Black women who studied or taught STEM subjects at Drexel. So whatever we have by and about them is scattered across collections. And since there haven't been a large number of Black women in STEM at Drexel, there's just going to be less material to find. But if a researcher were interested in this topic, we would try different search terms in our internal database and see what came up. We would look at different collections based on our general knowledge of Drexel and what our collections contain, and we'd provide some suggestions for where to start. And one thing an archivist can do is help a researcher prioritize their research. So we can tell them, you know, where what will take a long time to go through and what will take less time, what is most likely to have useful information, you know, based on the research angle or the amount of time that an archivist has to look through material. So archival research is often unpredictable and time-consuming. You may go through lots of boxes and find nothing particularly useful or only scattered scraps of information. And you have to keep an eye out for threads to pull on, and then follow up with those. This is similar to looking up citations in scholarly works and following up on ideas and terms you run into when you're reading. In an archival context, as an example, if you're researching Black women in STEM at Drexel, and this is the sort of research where you will go through lots of boxes and not find a whole lot. Say you were looking at photos of faculty members in the Drexel yearbooks, and you identified some Black women who are faculty in STEM departments. So then you could ask us to do a search of their names in our internal database and see if they show up elsewhere in our collections. You'd also know which departments and which time periods to focus on. Another difference is that you may have to visit or at least talk to more than one archives. You usually get all the secondary sources you need through one library, whether they're paper or digital, or if you have to use Easy Borrow or interlibrary loan. But since archival items are unique and don't get loaned out, you often have to go to where they are if you want to use them. So what is it actually like to do research in an archives? To a large extent, this is shaped by the measures that all archives have in place to keep the materials in good condition, so that people can continue using them for research for decades and perhaps even centuries to come. And each archives has its own rules and guidelines. There's a lot of variants, but there are some that are very common, and I will go over those. Before you start using archival material, there's usually going to be some sort of security before you enter. And this varies wildly, but it's not uncommon to need to show a government-issued photo ID. In our case, Drexel's security policies about entering the building mean researchers who aren't affiliated with Drexel need to leave a photo ID at the entrance to Haggerty. But this varies from metal detectors, at like a federal archives and versus just you knock on a door and they unlock it. Another thing is you may be allowed to bring food and drink in to an archives if they're in securely sealed containers, but you should ask before you bring in anything besides a closed water bottle, because policies about this will vary a lot. And you will need to leave the reading room if you want to eat or drink anything. Archivists take this very seriously. This is all for the preservation of the materials. And another thing is that typically you'll only keep what you need to do the actual research with you. You'll leave your coat, your bag, whatever, elsewhere. Often archives have lockers outside the reading room. In our case, we just have a coat rack in the corner of the reading room where people can leave their things. And you'll want to have clean hands when you're handling archival material, just to avoid getting them grimy. Though we're washing our hands so much these days that I'm just going to assume that people have clean hands at this point. And you'll probably be offered asked to use cotton or nitrile gloves if you're handling photographs, because even when we've just washed our hands, they will have oils that will cause damage to photographs in the long term. But wearing gloves while handling paper, especially brittle paper, actually makes it more likely that you'll damage it. So gloves are probably just for photographs. So then when you're actually doing research, computers, tablets, phones, cameras, those are all typically fine. And paper and pencil are as well, but definitely no pens. And archives will have, or they should have, pencils available for researchers. You will probably be permitted to take photos for personal reference, but without flash. However, this varies depending on the archives and perhaps on the specific thing that you're working with, so you should ask first. Okay, I already said that, sorry. Got confused about something. So how do you actually find an archives that has material that is relevant to what you want to learn more about? Like I said, we are planning to have a separate webinar on the subject in the future, but I'm going to go over the different kinds of archives to kind of give you a sense of the lay of the land and the kind of variability of archives. So I'm going to provide examples, mostly from the Philadelphia area, to give a sense of the variety and to show how it's often not obvious where a relevant or interesting collection may be. And so the categories I'm talking about are kind of arbitrary. There's definitely more than one way to categorize archives, and many archives don't fall neatly into just one of these categories, but this is just to kind of provide an introduction. So in no particular order, historical societies focus on local history at the level of the town, city, county, or state, typically. In Philadelphia, we have the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the Chestnut Hill Historical Society, and the Germantown Historical Society. Then there's government archives, which have government records that are no longer in active use. And so these range from a local town to the National Archives and Records Administration at the federal level. And then in Philadelphia, we have the Philadelphia City Archives, and as well as a regional branch of the National Archives. some archives have, they collect records about a specific subject. And so these may be independent or they may be part of a larger institution like a university. So there's the Science History Institute, which is an independent archives. And then there's Swarthmore College has the Friends Historical Library, which focuses on the history of Quakers. Now, museums often have archives. In Philadelphia, the African American History Museum has an archives. The scope of that is obvious. And then UPenn's museum, their archives includes records of archaeological expeditions that the museum has organized and funded, among many other types of records. And then there are community archives, which are not very common. What sets them apart is that the community whose history they preserve is usually the source of all or most funding. And the archives serve that community first and foremost. And they're typically independent and not part of the larger institution. An example would be the John Wilcox Jr. Archives at the William Way Community Center, which is an archives that documents the history of LGBTQ+ people in the Philadelphia area. Then there's digital archives, contrary to what I said about, the majority of archival material not being online. In these cases, these are archives where everything actually is online, and they're obviously a pretty new development. And digital archives provide a way to bring together geographically scattered collections which cover a specific topic. So for example, the South Asian American Digital Archives is based in Philadelphia in that they have an office where their staff do their work, but all the actual material is online. And then there are institutional repositories like Drexel University Archives. And institutional repositories will have pretty much only material created by different units within the university, people affiliated, in our case, affiliated with Drexel or in some way connected to Drexel. So my best general tip is to ask an archivist. Archivists are familiar with other repositories in the region and will most likely be very happy to suggest archives to reach out to. Librarians may also be able to help, especially if you're researching local history or genealogy, though they will be less familiar than archivists with what archives are out there or how to find archives that focus on specific subjects. It's often not obvious what archives has relevant material. Googling is usually not helpful because archives gets used in lots of contexts besides what we're talking about. The name of an archives may not indicate that they have what you're looking for. But for example, it's not self-evident that of all the universities in the Philadelphia area, Temple University is the one with a very large archives about the history of Philly. So that's why we're planning to have a separate webinar in the future. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected access to archival materials. Many archivists have been working remotely for months. Some archives are reopening now, so researchers can make appointments, but at a smaller capacity. At Drexel, researchers may make appointments to do research if they meet certain criteria, and due to university policy, only researchers with a Dragon card can enter university buildings for now. This is obviously an evolving situation, so things may change. And so I've included some resources to kind of get you started, finding, exploring what archives and the finding aids, the collections that they have that are out there, kind of focusing on some that are in the Philly area or in Pennsylvania. And I also have a glossary at the end of some of the terms I threw around a lot, just so that you know what they mean or what they mean in a specifically archival context. Thank you for your time. And if you have any questions about any of this or anything about archives, please get in touch with us at archives@drexel.edu.
Great, thank you so much, Simon. If anybody has any questions they want to type in the chat, I'll give you a minute or two. And if not, just a reminder that we do have several other webinars coming up related to the archives, and you can find all that information on our website. The link is in the chat. And as Simon mentioned, please reach out and let us know if you have.
Oh, Elizabeth is in the waiting room. Can you? Oh, okay. Um,